Great. So my name is Josh Zuckerman. I'm with the Delta Institute. Today we'll be presenting on expanding Chicago grass-fed beef to grow Illinois grazing. Our agenda, we'll do a little welcome and introductions. We'll talk about why grass-fed and grazing, the potential for Illinois in the Chicago market. We'll do an overview of the buyer's guide that we've developed, as well as our direct marketing resource guide. We'll share our key takeaways, next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So please feel free during the webinar today to enter into chat any questions you have. We'll be recording them, monitoring them as the presentation goes on. And when we get to the Q&A section, we will try to answer all those questions to the best of our ability, try to get to all the questions. My name is Josh. I'm the lead for the Resilient Agriculture portfolio at the Delta Institute. Today we've got Pete with us, Kelsey and Lucas. Everyone's going to have an opportunity to speak, and they will introduce themselves as we get to them. And today we'd like to know a little bit about who you are. We have a quick little poll, see where everyone is and what they do. If you could answer that quickly, we'll just get a quick little idea. Nonprofit organizations across the board today, government and nonprofit and the producers. Great. Well, thanks. Now we know who we're speaking to. We appreciate that. The Delta Institute, just to give a little background, we are a Midwest nonprofit based in Chicago. I like to say that we are a sustainability organization that likes to focus on sustainability solutions for our community. We have three portfolios: resilient agriculture, nature-based climate solutions, and sustainability support services. As I mentioned, I'm the lead for the resilient agriculture portfolio. Lucas is also from the Delta Institute, and he will be speaking later today and introduce himself. Delta's impact statement in agriculture work. We are trying to work with 1,000 farmers and have impact over 1 million transitioning acres by 2025. We work on a spectrum of different topics. Here we're talking about supply chain for grass-fed beef. We look at soil health, land valuation, and we also help farmers with direct assistance and guiding them in the transition to regenerative agriculture. At this point, Pete's going to start to take over and give you a little information about the Wallace Center and the Pasture project.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Appreciate that. So this work's being presented in the partnership between the Delta Institute and the Wallace Center. Before I go further, just a quick shout out and thanks to Foodland Opportunity, who helps to fund this work and the work that we do. We have been working together for many years, and that's all come through the generous support of Foodland Opportunity. The Wallace Center, as 50% of this partnership, we're a 40-year-old organization. We've been around for nearly 40 years, and we really focus on this idea of bringing together diverse people and ideas with the goal of co-creating solutions that really help with the health of farms, with equity within economic exchanges, and resiliency within food systems overall. Everything we do is rooted in equity and justice in farming and food systems, knowing that we really have to focus on benefits for everyone. And we do that through two goals that are on the screen there around strengthening the change ecosystem and reimagining and redesigning farming and food systems. Our work through the Pasture project, which I'll speak to here in just a moment, is more on that right-hand side within our regenerative land use, but also within the values-based supply chain. To say a few more words about the Pasture project, the Pasture project is about a 10-year-old initiative that's been focused on advancing regenerative grazing in the upper Midwest, really with a market-driven approach to building healthy soil, farms that can sustain and be viable, and also resiliency in communities as things change. We work with a lot of different folks in that effort in the Midwest and beyond. And so you can see some of those on here: farmers and land managers, but all the way up to other organizations and public agencies. And it's all about helping to build good resources, good information, and build better relationships that remove barriers ultimately. There's a lot more that you can learn about us, wallacecenter.org, as well as pastureproject.org. Pasture Project has a lot more of our producer-specific resources that are looking just at regenerative grazing. So a lot more we could say there, but we're going to just take a quick pause here, or a quick transition, to talk about why we're here today, ultimately, which is kind of why are we interested in regenerative grazing and why are we interested in grass-fed beef ultimately. So when we look at regenerative grazing, whoops, slides are kind of skipping around a little bit, but here we are. regenerative grazing is really a principle-driven practice that's about building healthy soil and using livestock to build that healthy soil, and doing that both on perennial and annual forages. But it's something that supports a much larger goal around human and ecosystem health, farm profitability, and community and food system resilience. It's one approach within agriculture. It's not the approach. It doesn't work. It's not appropriate everywhere. So it's about using the right tool in the right place with regenerative grazing. And just important to note that, regenerative grazing is not a new idea. It's really drawing on traditional knowledge that's both, been handed to us, but also that is living and present within communities, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so just a really important note around credit for some of the ideas and principles and practices that go into regenerative grazing, really coming from those communities that still are with us in the Midwest and leading. But it also draws on modern technology. The whole idea is to really rejuvenate the landscape and the human relationships with that landscape. So it moves beyond that sustainability. It does provide pathways for building out, a transition in Illinois agriculture. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, this whole idea of leveraging demand for a product like grass-fed beef and what that might mean for incentivizing and driving grazing in the Midwest. So if we talk about grass-fed meats in particular, sorry, a little sensitive hair trigger here. This idea that we know that animals that are well raised on pasture can really be sources of healthy and humane meats, and we know that that's increasingly demanded by a lot of different customers. And one of the things that we can see is that that is a growing sector. COVID obviously impacted meat and meat production and processing, but we have seen that it's grown demand overall. We know that Chicago, when we think about it, it's no stranger to the meat industry. Chicago has a long history in terms of livestock and meat packing, and how consumers in this largest Midwest city and one of the largest cities in the United States, how they make decisions about meat and what they prefer and purchase can really influence not just the region, but the whole country. And what we found over several years of work is that there's a strong demand and a growing demand for grass-fed meat in Chicago, but ultimately, much like many places, it's not being served adequately by producers in Illinois or in the Midwest region overall. So we really are setting ourselves to this task of ultimately figuring out how to connect the dots between regenerative grazing and the demand for grass-fed. To take you back to that long ago time of 2020, we at the Wallace Center in partnership with Delta took a look at this question for the whole state of Illinois. And we tried to ask, how could we grow grazing through improved value chain coordination, which value chain coordination is about how do we strengthen and support the relationships to help hold value and produce value for everyone that's associated with producing food, from the farmer and the producer to the labor and the workers, all the way through the consumer, and making sure that we're balancing value and creating a lot of opportunities along the way. And we found that 40,000 acres would ultimately provide all of the necessary beef for the growth and demand within Chicago, not what it is currently, but how it is growing. We could capture all of that growth in Chicago by just adding 40,000 acres in Illinois for perennial or well-managed pasture and regenerative grazing. And that roughly is equivalent to about 2,100 animals. So that is a somewhat reasonable goal when you look at the overall composition of agriculture in Illinois, which is quite large. We know that there's about 180 grass-fed beef producers in 2020. We know COVID obviously changed things for folks. Those are 180 grass-fed beef producers in Illinois, and also most of those are within 50 miles of a small USDA or state inspected plant. So that tells us that there is a core, it's a small group of producers, but they are able to access the processing. There's always room for improvement. We can say more about that a little bit later. And we also have seen that the consumer data within Chicago indicates a significant demand for grass-fed and that it's growing, knowing that consumers there increasingly would prefer to buy from local or regional producers. So this all bodes well. We know that you can't always fix things on a statewide level. It's quite significant. So we tried to zero in a little bit more closely. So a year later in 2021, we looked more closely at the watersheds that surround Chicago. And the reason for that is because they have the easiest access to the Chicago metropolitan region, and access does make a difference in terms of profitability. So we looked to see, of all the watersheds around Chicago, which ones made the most sense. Watershed is just an easy way for us to break up the landscape. It's something that not a lot of folks think about watersheds or where they live, but it's a way for us to understand and kind of segment out different parts of the state. So through a rigorous analysis, and we'll provide those links in the second year of our project, we found that the Kishwaukee and Upper Fox watersheds of Chicago was the best watersheds of the Chicago region to really contribute or grow regenerative grazing and grow supply of grass-fed beef to the markets in Chicago. And specifically, the proportion of those watersheds that would contribute to that 40,000 acre goal for the state is 2,354 acres, which is about 0.4% of the total cropland in the Kishwaukee and Upper Fox. So a very small portion of that watershed has to change to contribute to a statewide goal of growing 40,000 acres. And important to note that we're not talking about cutting down forests to create cropland or pasture land. That's not where we want to go. It's about converting cropland that is lower profitability. It's also more vulnerable or contributing a lot in terms of water quality problems. So we're really focused about conversion of cropland with that $2,300 acre figure there. We did a bunch of scenarios, which I'll talk about here on the next slide, about how we could grow grazing in this area. It's not so easy to change things on the ground. It takes time, it takes money, and more importantly, it takes relationships with landowners and producers to want to make the transition. And we know we need to give them a market pull so that they want to, they know that their transition will be backed by a business case for transition and ultimately some profitability in the marketplace. We took all of that we did in year 2 and we wrote it into a lot of different reports, but more importantly, we laid it out in front of a group of producers and agriculture educators in the Kishwaukee and Upper Fox watersheds and asked them what they thought. And they gave us a lot of really great feedback, which is incorporated into our reports. But one of the things that came to the top here was a suggestion that really about Chicago direct markets for beef were not being leveraged as well as they could, and that there was a lot of opportunity there that simply wasn't being used because producers maybe didn't know that those opportunities exist or didn't have the resources to effectively set up their direct marketing enterprises for their meat products. And also that we needed to work with buyers in Chicago to help them understand the benefit and the demand for grass-fed beef in Chicago. So we had 2 stars that kind of came out of this that helped us with our navigation for year 3. And that's what we'll go into a little bit more fully here in their coming slides. I want to just lay this out really quickly because this map that was made, we did an actual modeler for the Kishwaukee and Upper Fox so that we could get really specific about acreage. And I won't spend too much time on here, but the thing that's important to note here is that we can specifically target the areas where grazing would be most beneficial and where direct market enterprises could be leveraged most effectively. And so we have some clear pathways to get to that 2,300 acre goal within the Kishwaukee Upper Fox, and a lot of it comes from taking cropland out of production that's on high slopes, so 4 to 8% or more, getting that really hilly land out of cropping and putting it into perennial cover, in this case pasture land, and also specifically focusing on acres that are really close to streams and water bodies because we know that they're the ones that are most likely contributing to water quality issues. So this is a modeler that's live. We won't go into it now, but it's something that we can talk about in the future, or you can check it out online. We also did a lot of value chain coordination mapping in the Kishwaukee, and this is important for what we're going to talk about today because these pins on the map are what we're trying to connect with the resources that we've produced. So over the course of 2021, we did a lot of database research, desktop research, interviews with individuals, experts, and mapped all of the different value chain nodes within the Kishwaukee Upper Fox region that helps move meat through the system to buyers, knowing that we have to connect all these really well. And so what you see on the map or on the screen in front of you is this map that these are actual businesses that have addresses and are participating on some way. Everything from input suppliers, whether it's fencing or veterinary services, all the way through to restaurants and farmers markets with slaughtering and slaughter facilities, processing, livestock haulers in between. And what we found is that, we need to drive this work forward because land development in this area is putting a lot of pressure on farms, and value chain coordination can help increase the profitability per acre for regenerative grazing. We also know that there's a lot of producers that are here in the watershed, but they just need to be better connected. So resources like what we're going to share with you ultimately are key to their business evolution. We know that there are slaughter facilities here. We can talk a lot about direct marketing and about buying in the Chicago region, but a key bottleneck is around slaughter and processing. And we know that there's an opportunity for investment in those facilities to help direct marketing enterprises for meat move more successfully through, especially with the very small and small. And we're seeing a lot of movement on the federal level and on the state level to get money to those facilities. So it's a really opportune time to connect the dots here. And that, again, like I said, direct marketing is an easy way for farms to start to build some of their profitability per acre. And we reached this conclusion of it's not if direct marketing works for livestock producers, it's how. And that direct marketing should be considered, especially in the age of online buying, should be considered as a component of any livestock operation, because the money is there and increasingly consumers are willing to be quite flexible and purchase meat directly from local producers in many different ways, again, including getting it shipped to them in the mail, which was a really unique outcome of COVID, was how people perceived online ordering for meat. I will pause there because we have a lot more that we could say, but I wanted to take you on a little bit of a journey that started with the statewide perspective that really was focused on what could Chicago do for Illinois in terms of grazing lands, and then how do we zero that into a specific place like the Kishwaukee Upper Fox for some real solutions for real businesses, including farms, that ultimately helps boost their profitability. And then we produced 2 resources that helped connect the dots between those that are selling animals and meat products with those that want to buy those meat products. So I'll pause there and I'm going to hand it over to Lucas, who's going to talk a little bit about the buyer end of things.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. Let me see if I can control the screen here. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Lucas Chamberlain. I am an associate with the Delta Institute. And as Pete mentioned, I will be describing Delta's research into the meat market, the demand for grass-fed beef in the Chicago region. And I'll also be going over some of the buyer's guides that came out of that research. And so our research was really focused on the Chicago metropolitan statistical area, or the Chicago MSA. And this is a geography that is defined by the US Census Bureau with approximately 9.5 million inhabitants and nearly 3.8 million households. And as you can see on the map here on the screen, the Chicago MSA includes 15 counties from Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. So this is where we were performing our market research. We were really interested in these direct marketing channels, which are wherein sales are made using only 1 or 2 stages between the site of production and the end consumer. And to perform this research, we used publicly available inventory and maps of businesses that are engaged in direct marketing of grass-fed beef products within this Chicago metropolitan statistical area. We also conducted interviews with stakeholders from within these market channels, and we were asking these folks about what kind of products they were selling, at what price, what their customers prefer, and how they marketed these products. And from this, we identified 4 primary user groups that I'll be discussing further that are the primary user groups of these direct marketing channels. And these would be farmers markets, restaurants, specialty retailers, which include grocers and butchers, as well as direct retailers, which include on-farm stores, community-supported agriculture, or CSAs, as well as co-ops. And some broad kind of takeaways from our market research. The good news is that, as Pete mentioned, there is an opportunity for local grass-fed beef producers to expand their production and to meet a growing demand for grass-fed beef products in the Chicago region. We found that 1 out of 5 Chicago consumers prioritize purchasing grass-fed beef. These consumers typically view grass-fed beef as a healthier, higher quality, and more humane meat option. We also found more broadly that consumer spending habits in the US are shifting more towards these more localized market channels due to the interest, again, in the quality of the product, but also the sourcing of the product. And that these consumer trends are being largely driven by millennials and individuals that are living within urban areas like the Chicago MSA. On the other hand, of course, there are market barriers that we identified and that we'll be touching on in the coming slides. But just broadly, some of these barriers that prevent the expansion of grass-fed beef within direct market sales within the Chicago metropolitan region would be high costs, issues with distribution and supply chain, transportation and storage infrastructure, as well as largely a lack of online marketplaces. So let's get into farmers markets as one of our main user groups. We found that there are a lot of farmers markets in the Chicago metropolitan statistical area, and 156 to be exact, and that customers at farmers markets within Chicago are spending approximately $28 to $35 per visit. Some other good news is that we found that a substantial fraction, 26 to 34% of our survey respondents were self-reporting as first-time buyers at farmers markets. However, none of the grass-fed beef vendors at Chicago farmers markets were located within this metropolitan statistical area. So that means that these vendors are traveling long distances to sell their products at farmers markets. And as a result of the transportation logistics, they're typically selling prepackaged frozen cuts at farmers markets. So some of the main takeaways in terms of market barriers at farmers markets, again, the transportation of the product. Vendors are traveling long distances to attend these markets. Largely, there is a lack of capacity at the farmers market level to facilitate online shopping. So that also is inhibiting online sales. And as well as a lack of electrical infrastructure at farmers markets. They are not equipped to host several grass-fed beef vendors and the deep freezers that are required to store their frozen meat. Luckily, there is room for improvement at farmers markets. We see that, consumer habits are shifting towards these more locally sourced market channels. So if farmers markets can improve their electrical infrastructure to facilitate these deep on-site deep freezers, they can entice more vendors, and also ways to offset the travel costs and incentivize more vendors to attend markets would be by offering some kind of some improved scheduling flexibility for vendors, including drive-through pickup or delivery of prepacked box programs, while also reducing booth rental pricing. Moving on to restaurants. Restaurants nationwide are the site of approximately 46% of all grass-fed beef sales, but only a small fraction of Chicago restaurants are selling grass-fed beef, and those that do are typically selling burgers and steaks. We found that only 2 out of the over 150 grass-fed beef producing farms in this region are selling directly to restaurants. Instead, restaurants are typically buying from distributors. And as a result of that, only 17% of the demand for locally produced meat products in Chicago is being met. The good news is there is a large untapped market for this consumer base, as only 15% of Chicago restaurant consumers that we spoke to have eaten grass-fed beef. And those the restaurants that we spoke with mentioned that their consumers were responding positively to seeing sourcing information about where they're getting their grass-fed beef on menus and marketing materials. Overall, we found that restaurants that provided these consumers with this information we're seeing increased price premiums and favorable consumer response. Now moving on to specialty retailers, we found that the majority of Midwesterners are buying their beef products from specialty retailers like grocers and butchers. In turn, these specialty retailers are buying their meat from distributors in far and away more so than buying directly from farmers. We also found, as Pete previously mentioned, purchasing meat online is becoming more and more common, especially among younger consumers. And butchers that we spoke to reported that the consumers that were interested in grass-fed beef were interested in that product because of the sourcing, as well as their perception of grass-fed beef as being a healthier product and being higher quality as well. However, there are some barriers that are limiting this expansion of grass-fed beef at the specialty retail level. Higher costs. The product has a price premium, and that is cost prohibitive. As I mentioned previously, that most of these retailers are using distributors to buy their beef, so there's a lack of distribution infrastructure. And also some butchers that we spoke to mentioned that their consumers lack an understanding of the grass-fed beef, or really the beef supply chain in general, and rather being less interested in the sourcing or the quality of the product, are more interested in other characteristics like the cut of the beef and the USDA rating. So there is room for improvement here at the specialty retail level by educating consumers, or at least providing information, as we've seen previously. This can encourage sales at of these products. And as you will see, this is becoming a recurring theme. Purchasing meat online is a very lucrative option, and we highly encourage that option as well to facilitate this younger demographic who are increasingly buying grass-fed beef. Finally, let's move on to the direct retail level. And so these are co-ops, CSAs, and farm stores. Again, we found that 34% of our survey respondents were first-time buyers from buying directly from producers. And we found that online shopping directly from producers had grown by 16% in 2020. And then one farm store that we spoke to said that on average, folks are spending approximately $60 at their stores. And they're buying multiple products, and the beef sales are about 25% of its revenue. And these are typically ground beef and steaks. We also see that CSAs are incredibly important for farm sales nationally, and that the average amount of subscribers in a CSA was about 141. Again, some of the barriers that are in place here would be higher costs. The price premium on grass-fed beef may be cost prohibitive. And we also found that only half of the producers in our project's geography were using online shopping. And so that there really money's being left on the table for a lack of online marketplaces. And so our recommendations to co-ops and CSAs, the good news is that demand for CSA services we found has increased and is expected to stay high based on the consumer feedback that we received. We would recommend that CSAs can expand their further expand their growth by expanding their product offerings, extending their seasons, and they can reach new customers by supporting nutrition assistance programs. Again, to underline the importance of e-commerce and online shopping, purchasing meat online is becoming more and more common, especially among younger customers. So there's an opportunity here to offer more online purchasing by using e-commerce. And so I would like to just couch all of these findings with a few limitations. Market research is inherently very difficult to do because of tracking products once they leave the farm, consumer behavior and trends. All of these are very difficult to find conclusions from because of the amount of variables that are inherent in this market research. We should also mention that a lot of this research was done during the COVID-19 pandemic, so there's certainly some variables at play there. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, is that the producers and buyers are very busy and they don't really have a lot of time to speak with folks like us. So they can also be, that can further complicate this market research. And so with that, I'd like to hand it off to my colleague, Kelsey at the Wallace Center.
Yeah, thanks, Lucas. I'm Kelsey Vergin. I'm a project manager with the Wallace Center. And I'm going to walk through the beginner's resource guide to direct marketing meat that we created as part of this project. So as Pete mentioned earlier, after phase 2 work and analysis, that we realized the best path for producers for entering the Chicago market was through direct marketing. And we discussed with farmers what tools they needed to direct market effectively, and producers told us they needed resources on how to direct market, but also want to understand what buyers wanted. So we took that mandate, and from that, we pursued the creation of this producer-focused resource guide. That is filled with curated resources and is designed for that foundational knowledge. It's also really geared towards beginners. although there are some more advanced and extensive resources included that could benefit all levels of expertise. And we also want to say this guide is really kind of the first of its kind, at least from our knowledge and research, and is meant to be iterative and hoping that it will be a living document and it can adapt and change with time. Great. So some steps we took to create the guide. We sent targeted surveys to 9 producers in the Chicago region that direct market already to find out what tools and resources they wanted and valued and needed, and in what media forms. After those surveys, we conducted follow-up interviews with 7 producers to dive deeper into topics such as financials, sales, professional development, and marketing. And we wanted to understand with these interviews challenges and opportunities producers were experiencing with direct marketing and what information they needed to be more successful. Some key takeaways from those interviews were almost everyone mentioned how important consumer education is, and of course the time it takes to educate consumers on products, and this can be time-consuming and a pretty big challenge. Farmers told us that they know where to find resources on topics like animal husbandry, crop rotation, but very little on topics like enterprise development, marketing, customer management. So this guide is not focused, the resources are not focused on how to raise livestock, how to raise animals, but more on how to process and sell them in through direct market channels. So we also connected with other partners in this space like Chicago Food Policy Action Council and the Good Meat Project. We really wanted to design an approach that was complementary to these local and national partners. So also what we heard from the interviews was the importance of creating something very simple and easy to access, and not necessarily comprehensive of every single resource out there, but more of a very curated list of resources that were very accessible. So the structure of this resource guide is straightforward and simple. So first we go over our work with Delta Institute and kind of how we got to this point, why we created this guide. We talk about what is direct marketing. And then there's a self-reflection exercise in the guide. And this exercise is a list of questions that's meant to help producers, take stock of their assets and resources they might already have. There are no right or wrong answers. It's really just an opportunity to gather thoughts before exploring the resources. Some examples of these questions are, what about your farm and meat products will stand out to customers? Where do you want to sell your products, whether that's online, farmers markets, on farm? Also, who could you partner with on your farm or in your community to make your direct marketing enterprise more successful? So the goal with this exercise is just to really help producers create a direct marketing relationship management plan that will help them be successful in direct marketing. But of course, the most of the guide, the meat of the guide, if you will, is going to be focused on the best available resources for producers. So like I mentioned before, we created this curated list of resources based on feedback from producer surveys and interviews that we mentioned earlier, doing some of our own research and working with partners like the Good Meat Project and other value chain and direct marketing experts. First, we created a master spreadsheet and reviewed tons and tons of resources and prioritized them based on quality and accessibility. We also wanted to make sure there were different types of media, for example, news articles, videos, webinars, how-to guides, knowing that everybody consumes information differently. And from all that, we broke down the resources into 6 different categories. Direct marketing for beginners, so that very foundational knowledge. Business planning and financials, processing, butchering, cuts, and carcass breakdown. Marketing strategies, how to get new customers, labels and certifications. Where to sell your product. And funding for direct marketing operations, grants, things like that. But like I said, the bulk of the resource guide is resources, and it's really meant to be a starting point resource for producers, and we wanted to keep it very simple and easy to navigate, and this is just an example of what that looks like here. For example, each resource has the publisher, year it was published, category or resource type, the duration, and a quick description. So if you have time for a 2-hour webinar, go for it. If you only have time for a quick 1-pager, that's in here too. So really to meet producers where they are. And also, we're always open for feedback. So if there's a resource that you don't see in here that you think should be included, please let us know, and vice versa. If there's something that you're like, I've gone through this training and it's not useful, we welcome that feedback as well. So some limitations to this guide, we recognize that nothing is perfect. And like I said earlier, we want this to kind of be iterative and be able to change. So there's a lot of resources to review and assess, published by different sources over different periods of time. And we had to pick and choose based on what we heard from producers and what we could assess, but we couldn't cover everything. This project has, like all projects, has a limited time and budget, which prevents the creation of a more interactive way to navigate through resources based on different knowledge levels and needs. So we really had to focus this on kind of the beginner level. We recognize every producer is starting from a different place. Different producers have different levels of knowledge and different ways of learning. And creating a one-size-fits-all guide is really tricky. But with all that, I'm going to drop the link in the chat to the resource guide, and it's hosted on the Pasture Project website. We hope you find it's useful. As I mentioned, we're open to feedback, so feel free to reach out to us. And now I'm going to pass it back to Pete to talk about some takeaways and next steps.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. And just want to redirect folks to that chat for that link, just to take a look at it. So hopefully what we've done here is taking you on a little bit of a journey where we ask this big question of how do we grow grazing in the state of Illinois, which if for those of you that are familiar, it's not traditionally known as a grazing state, although historically it has produced a tremendous amount of grass in its kind of natural prairie state in the different parts of the state that before they were cropped ultimately. So we are trying to find the levers that we can pull to get us to more grazing in the state of Illinois for a lot of different reasons. Number one is that not all agricultural land should be cropped. In fact, we see a lot of the negative ramifications of that mindset of cropping everything. And we live in an age in which we have to take some serious strides towards water quality improvement, climate change, but also farm viability, farm profitability, and community viability and health. Those things have to be at the heart of any environmental solution that we're approaching or taking on, including regenerative grazing, and creating opportunities for all types of different producers, including those that have historically been underserved. So we've kind of looked at that question and that lever and followed it down to this idea of injecting a couple resources into the system to see if it stimulates a different relationship between grazing in the state and ultimately what people are eating in Chicago. And as my colleagues have highlighted, it's complicated. It's a big moving machine. Chicago's no small place. It's got quite a few people in it. And also influencing how farmers choose to take on different opportunities is not a straightforward one. It requires a lot of different customized and kind of one-on-one decision making at the farm level and at the family level. So the takeaways is that we know that direct marketing is an obvious opportunity for Illinois producers, but it can be a little bit difficult to navigate those opportunities because they're complex and they're unique to the farms as well as unique to the buyers. So our goal here is to ultimately provide a little bit of a nudge for both sides to find each other. We know that producers need direct and dedicated support to develop their direct marketing businesses. This is something that requires folks outside of the farming community to offer that support. Ag educators, folks that are working in different levels of government agencies and whatnot to create resources and funding and opportunities to support farmers to make the decisions that are best for themselves to access those direct markets. But to expect farmers to just do more isn't always necessarily the best solution, even when it might be in their financial interest to do so. There's a lot of barriers in place. So this is also a call for these guides to be used by different entities beyond just farmers and buyers, but of the whole ecosystem of folks that want to see transitions in agriculture in Illinois towards something that might be more regenerative and perennial. So just a call for those of you on this webinar to use these and to play your part in supporting those direct market relationships and businesses. The thing we'll also note is that we know that Chicago is not characterized by a strong value chain coordination professional network. And again, these are the individuals that are really the vasculature. They're connecting the points on that map that I showed you, from the producers through to the processing, slaughter and processing, through to the wholesale, retail, consumer education, and really making sure that value is preserved for everyone. And a lot of times the farmer gets less and less of the dollar, and value chain professionals help to make sure that the farmer gets more of that dollar, and also that labor and consumers are also not shortchanged in that process as well. So having a stronger network in a value chain professional network in Chicago is going to pay dividends, and we see that there's a real opportunity for that to be developed. That buyer-seller meetups is really where, you know, the rubber meets the road here, and we're kind of creating resources here that creates the opportunity for those conversations. But sometimes you just need to put folks in the room so that they can talk with each other and make those relationships. And thinking about doing buyer-seller meetups is an easy, an obvious opportunity. And we know that there's some examples of this happening with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, others that are out there that are trying to do a little bit of matchmaking, but there's a need there. And that they can be pretty easily done. We're not talking about launching to Mars. It's a pretty straightforward process to set up kind of a mixer meet and greet where folks can meet, talk about meat. So that's an easy thing that could be done in the city. And just that whole point around online and aggregated sales, it's increasingly available, the software, the platforms to be selling products, but farms don't always necessarily have the time nor the knowledge or sometimes the connectivity to leverage these tools, but they really are missing the opportunity if they are not. And so how can we support more online sales, e-commerce, and marketing direct support services to farms in Illinois so they can sell products to Chicago? And we'll add a couple points here about what we know could happen right away. So just a couple takeaways there. In terms of next steps, like Kelsey said and Lucas mentioned, take a look at these guides, one on the buyer side or those on the buyer side, those on the producer side, and let us know what works, what doesn't. We're not going to get our feelings hurt. We want to produce resources that actually help people and ultimately get more grass-fed beef from Illinois farms in the Chicago market. So please let us know if we missed a resource, if there's something that you know that we didn't include, just let us know, reach out. We also know that we're plugged into this larger national effort that's happening, that's being run by the Good Meat Project. They're a great outfit, worth checking out. They also run the Good Meat Breakdown, which we also would promote. It's in the buyer's guide, or sorry, in the producer's guide. But we know that they have these series that are ongoing right now called the Lowdown. The next ones are coming up on October 13th and November 10th at 1 Eastern. We'll share the links in the chat for this. But that's a specific call for grass-fed beef producers to get together and talk shop on marketing and what are they doing and how are they selling their products and being really effective there. So the Lowdown is a great place to go. There's the link right there in the chat for folks that want to check it out. The other thing that Good Meat Project is doing and that we're supporting them in developing is a cohort of producers from around the country that are ultimately working to, you know, get direct access to services around marketing and online sales. So this particular cohort right now is open for applications. Any producer can ultimately sign up for it. I'm not exactly sure how many slots they have, but I just put the link in there for the sign up for that cohort. And again, October 15th, and it's really about giving farmers direct technical assistance on marketing and e-commerce because of those particular bottlenecks. And last but not least, tell your neighbor about what we're talking about here and see if there's opportunities to share this resource, to share this idea. We know that direct marketing can work not just for individual farms, but also works really well for farms that are working together. And that it's an important point to say, direct marketing doesn't have to be a solo venture. It can be shared, and we see great examples throughout the Chicago region and Midwest where we see farmers coming together to direct market their products together. And so that's our last takeaway. Next step is to think about how could aggregating, working together, actually make things easier for you or the farmers that you work with. And that's the goal. Let's make it easier, not harder, for folks to be successful and to be paid well. So I'll pause there. I think that that's, you know, the main kind of core. We want to leave a little bit of time for questions here. a couple notes before we do. I'm going to turn it back over to Josh here to do some questions. But before we get there, so how do you access these things? Kelsey dropped the link for the producer's guide and accessible on Pasture project. The buyer's guides are getting final little polishes and will be on the Delta Institute website here directly. And so we just direct folks to go to the website, keep an eye on that. We're also going to be promoting these, so you'll see them coming through the same channels that you heard about this webinar. So that's where you can take a look at it, as well as a bunch of other really great stuff from the previous couple of years of work on this topic in Illinois. You can always get in touch with us. So there's the Pasture Project email, the Delta email, or you can reach out to us directly individually to answer any questions, take any feedback. We're open to all that. So just a plug here, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We'll go through those, but that's not my job, that's Josh's job. So I'm gonna pass it over to him.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate it. Thanks for sharing, Lucas, Pete, Kelsey. Great information there. Take control here, switch it over to our question slide. At this time, please feel free to drop any questions in the chat. I had a question that was asked to me earlier today in a meeting, and I get it all the time, so I just want to put it out there to all of us. If livestock contribute to greenhouse gases, how does grazing fit into our overall food system? I'm going to ask Pete to take a first stab at this one, and Kelsey and Lucas, please feel free to drop in. I mean, I get this all the time now that we're talking about integrating more livestock into production, that one of the key components of building soil health is the integration of livestock. So how does that really all fit in with greenhouse gas emissions in cows?
Yeah, that is a big question. And in grazing and beef, you know, it gets beat up a lot. It's kind of an easy place to throw some punches. And in some instances, well-deserved. I think, you know, we're talking about livestock production separate from, you know, when we're talking about animals that are finishing their life cycles on grass or on some kind of forage versus not, you know, we try to pull those things apart and recognizing that when we're talking about regenerative grazing, well-managed pasture that's producing a grass-fed, grass-finished product, that is different in and of itself than those that might be finishing on a different feedstock or, you know, off of pasture ultimately in some kind of confined feeding operation. So we try to pull those things apart, recognizing the impacts of both are different. And also within regenerative grazing and grass-fed, it's still not a clean, 100% perfect solution. But what we see is that it produces a much broader set of benefits for the ecosystem that it's in, for overall water quality, watersheds, climate change. So they're well-managed pasture, well-managed grassland, what we know is a high performer in terms of its ability to store carbon, to sink water, and to hold water, to increase biodiversity, and to be able to use that on lands that are currently being cropped, often at low to no profitability with a high level of water quality inputs, negative water quality inputs. It feels like an obvious transition point to say we need to move cropping on those highly vulnerable, low profitability acres in the state of Illinois towards well-managed perennial pasture that's being regeneratively grazed, knowing that it's going to provide a suite of benefits. And we tend to focus on those broader benefits because when we talk about climate change, it is about storing carbon, but that's not what it's all about. It's about restoring all of the ecosystem services that are needed for us to really be able to not just survive, but to thrive in a changing environment. And so the ability of pasture land to not only do its part with carbon, which, you know, we can have a longer conversation about carbon storage in grasslands, and there's a lot of kind of science that's still being figured out on that level. We know that its ability to slow and sink water is going to be helpful during drought, and it's going to help during floods, which has a downstream effect in terms of water quality and quantity. We also know that it is, from a biodiversity perspective, bugs and birds and whatnot, it's going to be better and a more diverse environment for a lot of different species that we are seeing in rapid decline, especially when we think about birds and some insect and pollinators. And I'd say the last thing is it's a way to produce food off of marginal land without tilling it and putting a lot of energy-intensive inputs into the soil that ultimately have a negative soil health impact, both in the biology of the soil as well as just the overall quantity and existence of that soil. It might be washing away otherwise. And so we see a lot of benefits here. So it's a nuanced answer. I just threw a lot of information out there, but it's a nuanced answer. What we know is that it is healthy to return animals back to the landscape, and we need to do that sensitively and intentionally. And so when we think about a place like the Kishwaukee Upper Fox, we're not saying put cows on every acre here. It's about let's target the acres in a watershed or watersheds like those two that really could benefit both environmentally, economically, and socially to transition us to a more diversified landscape. A more diverse ecosystem is going to be more resilient and productive and healthy on the long term that one is it's dominated by a monoculture of corn and soy. So a lot there. It's a great question and a good and complicated one.
That is a good and complicated one. I think from what you can see from these briefs and the direct support tool that we have here, it's not just about getting more cows on the land and grazing. It's about also having those direct channels to sell it, and then having consumers also know what the grass-fed beef is. It's a full market analysis here that it really more cows, more people buying it, more people selling it. It's all going to necessary to ultimately maybe lower greenhouse gas emissions, prevent runoff, sink water into the ground, all those great things that come with it. Let's see here. One question was from Michael. Where is that list of 259 restaurants that are selling grass-fed beef? Lucas, I think we have that. It's not really in a deliverable form. Maybe Lucas, if you could touch on it, if we could potentially clean it up, or Michael, if you email us, we could probably get you a list of that. It's in a dirty spreadsheet that wasn't really on our deliverable sheet here, but we definitely have that as a resource. Let's see questions here. Michael asks, grass-fed doesn't necessarily imply regenerative grazing nor indicate a particular method, holistic, intensive, rotational, etc. What will be needed to move forward grass-fed beef farmers to scientifically proven regenerative methods? It's a good question. Who would like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I can take a crack at it, and then of course don't want to be the only one saying things. Yeah, you're right, Michael. Grass-fed doesn't necessarily imply regenerative, just like organic doesn't necessarily imply regenerative, right? There's a lot of different ways that people think about production standards and inputs and what are going into something and what it actually produces. We very much focus on, what builds soil health. Is something building healthy soil? And ultimately, more broadly, is it actually producing profitability for not just the farm, but for the broader community? And also, is it producing opportunities that are fair and just to a wider swath of folks that are either currently farming or not? So we very much focus on regenerative as a very big perspective, but grass-fed and grass-finished, there's a lot of questions about what is actually in that product or what practices sit behind that product that is labeled as such. We didn't get into that nuance of labeling and label claims, as well as the fact that a lot of grass-fed beef, grass-finished beef, is also coming from outside of the United States. And there's a real sticky conversation around country of origin labeling, and we get into a very broad world, which is an important one, but it ultimately is really difficult when you have producers that are creating a really high quality grass-fed, grass-finished product that is based on really regenerative practices and outputs. And it's going up against a product on the shelves that maybe isn't doing such a great job, but it's selling at a lower price. And when we think about consumers, I think about myself or anyone else I know, you're going to the grocery store, you're not committing yourself to many hours of research. People are going in, they need to buy a product, they usually are looking at price and trying to make a decision based on that. And so we have to work on the consumer education to be willing to prefer and easily understand, when something is produced with a regenerative output, whether it's economic, environmental, social, and so that they are willing to commit those dollars to something. But also, to your question, how do we get more producers on board with this as well? A lot of it comes down to working on the business case for regenerative, recognizing that a big part of regenerative grazing is about getting inputs out of there, actually really reducing your overhead in terms of production. And regenerative practices can significantly reduce overall operating costs overhead for a farm. And so how do we really get it lean and mean in that regard And then how do we make sure that we're helping farms understand and see the benefits of regenerative, where they're noticing not just the health of the animals, but they're also noticing the quality of the life of, moving the animals and working with them, and maybe noticing some of the other benefits of, what does their field look like when it's a dry year compared to their neighbor who is not managing or continuously grazing. And same thing with, building stronger relationships with the consumers that want to really appreciate and respect those practices and ultimately support those farms. So it does take a lot of, working with farms to see the benefits. A lot of it begins with showing how it can work on the financial level. And the big sell there is, how do we reduce the overall cost of operation through keeping animals on well-managed pasture for longer, which the sun and forage is always going to be cheaper than some of the other inputs that folks rely on.
Also, as a tool to be able to move to scientifically proven regenerative methods, I believe we really need to institutionalize soil health testing. If you don't have a platform to really monitor and evaluate if your soil is actually regenerating, what is regenerative? Can you actually measure it? So soil health testing, there's so much work that's been done on it lately. It's really coming out as a basis of, if we test our soil, we can really see the methods that we are implementing, such as holistic intensive rotational, various other methods. You can actually measure your soil health improvements year after year after year and see how healthy it's really getting. As for like certifications on that, there's loads of certifications out there, but I really believe soil health testing is going to be the basis for that scientifically proven regenerative methods. Tracy asks, thanks for the great work project from the Pasture Project and Delta Institute. Could a next step look into the racial demographics of consumers and their access to grass-fed beef? Sure, of course. There could be so many ways of looking into it. The direct market research of who's buying what, where, and why, definitely a possibility of something to look into. It definitely gets into Delta's work, and I'm sure Pasture Project as well, on our diversity, equity, and inclusion of how we approach all projects. There's definitely a lot of data that can come out there. The data is widely available. If you would like to email us, we could definitely follow up with the sources that we use to find this information. And that data is definitely in there.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add on to that as well, because I do think that's a really important question, is that the goal here is not to produce a high-end, niche product for those that have the, discretionary income that can allow them to make those purchases. That is a starting point. And we have to be really clear about that, is that those buyers actually do generate and drive the volume that can come and ultimately lower the price or increase, access across multiple different communities. And we know that, access to income and capital and wealth is directly tied to race. And it's something that we have to take really, really seriously, and not just develop solutions that reinforce limited access or exclude folks from that. What I would say is that, how do we leverage those that do have the dollars to spend to grow the volume of Illinois producers, so that they can be producing of a quantity that allows them to have a little bit more flexibility in their price and start to move it into different markets or different channels that serve different communities ultimately. The other thing that I'll say is that a beef cattle produces a lot of different product, and some of them are really expensive and some of them are not as expensive. And so there's an opportunity there for price to come down, thinking creatively about moving different products, not lower quality, but just different products to different communities based on their preference and based on what they can afford.
Great. So that brings us to 1 o'clock exactly. We appreciate you all logging in to join us today and with our demonstration, what we presented here. If you have any more questions, please feel free to follow up. The previous slide here has our email addresses, if the slide loads. Otherwise, you can contact us via our websites. We really appreciate it, and see you next time.